Hello, welcome to Interdependent Study, our podcast where we engage in the learning and unlearning work for social justice and collective liberation. I'm Damien.
And I'm Aaron. Thank you so much for joining us today.
For those new to our podcast, Interdependent Study is meant to be a space and community for folks who believe in and want to do the work for social justice.
That's right. Each week we'll bring something new to the table, discuss our thoughts and feelings about it through the lenses of who we are and where we can go for a more just society.
You're right. That's right. We want Interdependent Study to be a space where we're always learning with one another.
Yeah.
And Aaron, my friend, you're up this week.
Yes.
What have you brought to the table today?
Yeah, I'm bringing The Radical King, which is a collection of essays and speeches written by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.
Yes.
So it's clever play on words there with the title.
Right.
The book was edited by Dr. Cornel West and was put together to demonstrate the way that Dr. King spoke directly to the source of issues and the real pain that's been present from the founding of the United States and up until today. Honestly, and we'll probably talk about this a little later, but a lot of the things he wrote or said, I think still apply today.
Absolutely.
There are moments I highlighted in the book that could be said word for word today and still be true.
Yep.
So aside from that, there are 4 parts of the book. They are radical love, prophetic vision, the revolution of nonviolent resistance, and overcoming the tyranny of poverty, and hatred.
Yeah.
And some of the big speeches and essays are in here too. Like Letter from a Birmingham Jail is in here. Beyond Vietnam, A Time to Break Silence, The Drum Major Instinct, and I've been to the Mountaintop. So that last speech he gave, and so there's a lot of really big, like famous speeches of his in here.
Yeah.
But to bring it back to the full concept of this book, Dr. West writes this. Quote, "This book unearths a radical king that we can no longer sanitize. His revolutionary witness, embodied in anti-imperial, anti-colonial, anti-racist, and democratic socialist sentiments, was grounded in his courage to think, his courage to love, and his courage to die. Could it be that we know so little of the radical king because such courage defies our market-driven world?" Which I think just encapsulates so much about what you read, right?
Yes.
And that's something from the introduction that Dr. West wrote. I think it's really remarkable to see and read and take in so much of his philosophy written out in this way when mostly we experience his words and life mostly like nowadays through like short video clips or the soundbite quotes. So I'm excited to dig in a little bit today, and I really enjoyed and appreciated like actually reading the whole book.
Yes.
But yeah, so what stuck out to you?
Yeah, I actually love that. I think I don't remember because the introduction was so long ago in my reading. But this idea that Dr. West said that his courage defied our market-driven world, right? I love that, and I think that to me was so evident in getting to sort of read through all of these speeches and all of his remarks throughout the book. I mean, he really stayed sort of true to his conviction throughout, his lifetime and his work, and so.
You see that. I think you see it evolve.
Yes,
but you see the core of it, like sort of remain pretty constant in terms of being driven by love and what love might look like publicly.
100%, right? And so, I'm with you. This was a phenomenal book. Just a really incredible way, sort of personal way for us to be able to look into the mind, the heart, the soul of Dr. King and to really sort of get a glimpse into a full-on look at really his vision, his radical vision for this country that we're in, but also for the world, right? Because he was very much attuned to what was happening globally, right, across the globe, and really for humanity, I think, right? And so I absolutely loved getting to read this book. I think, some of this isn't necessarily new to me, right? But this book really just illuminated how moving and inspiring he was, right? I think especially given how time and time again in all of his speeches and whatnot, like we just talked about, like we see his clear commitment his really unapologetic commitment to Black people and to marginalized people in their communities, to certainly to the poor and the working class. But also, I love, he had a true commitment to peace, right, and really sort of stood vehemently against the Vietnam War and really war in general. He was committed to nonviolence in organizing and movement work. And so I think that was my biggest takeaway from this book, right? And sort of getting to read and consume his words and his thinking in this format, just his overall conviction to his beliefs. And so I think the pages on the words on the pages really sort of make it clear to me that he stood firm in those convictions. And like you said, he sort of grew in that. But I was really just moved by his conviction. And I think it's why he is remembered and why we honor him in this way, as this radical king that deserves to be remembered as such, Yeah,
definitely. I think, we've taken his legacy and sort of shrunken it down and manipulated it to mean just a few words from his most famous speech. And his words have been twisted to somehow mean that ignoring racism is the correct way forward, or ignoring race is the way, the path forward. And that's just amazing, honestly. Like that if you just read this book, you're like, well, this is such a ridiculous way to manipulate what this man said,
absolutely,
and what he stood for. I'm thinking about, I don't even remember who it was, but somebody on Twitter was saying to Dr. King's daughter, like, this isn't what your father was saying. I was like, what? What are you talking about?
How dare you?
I don't even remember what the context was in that, but I was like, look at this lunacy.
Right.
Like, it's preposterous, like what you're saying.
And we have the words to prove it.
So one of the other aspects that really spoke to me was his criticism of the way capitalism happens in this country. And he has this famous quote that this country has socialism for the rich and rugged individualism for the poor. And he balanced that with his own criticism of communism, which he felt was missing something. And he wanted to find the best of both of these systems that would create something new. He said, quote, "And the kingdom of brotherhood is found neither in the thesis of communism nor the antithesis of capitalism, but in a higher synthesis. It is found in a higher synthesis that combines the truths of both." Now, when I say questioning the whole society, it means ultimately coming to see that the problem of racism, the problem of economic exploitation, and the problem of war are all tied together. These are the triple evils that are interrelated. He really envisioned something beyond what currently exists.
Yes.
And he wanted us to reach for a system that met all of our needs. Beyond what capitalism was doing and what communism offered. And I think that's particularly true in the context of what was happening in the world, where a lot of what was called communism wasn't actually communism, was really totalitarianism. But I thought that was astute to like sit back and look at these philosophies, look at these systems, and find that we need something beyond what we currently know. We need ways to create something new that's maybe a fusion of what we know, but is really going to end up being entirely different.
Yeah, it was incredible to just sort of see how visionary he was in that way, and how just it was astounding to see how he could sort of, consume all of this literature and research and folks' visions for things, could understand and look at the world in a way and say, where the flaws were, what was working in a system, but where the flaws were too, right? And as you sort of said, try to envision something new or figure out, how we get the best of both worlds. I mean, he did that with so many of our social ills, right? And issues within our society. And so that was brilliant to see. I love that. So I'm glad you brought that up. I think so. I resonate with that. I think in so many ways, in thinking about that, like I felt so inspired by him and continue to learn from his words, right? I think what this book really does is it provides stories, right? It provides so many stories and insights and reflections from really pivotal and momentous times, not only in his life and his career, but also in our history. That there's a lot for us to learn from, and as you say, a lot of these things we continue to see, and so we can certainly continue to learn from them. One of the things that I wanted to talk with you about here was just how I was really so compelled by his chapter about the Montgomery bus boycott, and the stories in it. Right, there were individual personal stories that he shared about folks who engaged in that boycott that were, gut-wrenching to read and to understand what folks went through. But also the stories about him. Like at one point he's speaking at an organizing meeting, right? And he tells the group that if he were to be killed, he didn't want them to retaliate with any violence, right? And continue the work. I think his words were with dignity and discipline. Yeah. But at the same time that's happening, like he and his family are receiving daily death threats, right? And then later on,
at one point, was this this might not have been the book, but at one point, like he leaves a meeting because his family, like there's been an attack at his home.
Yeah. Oh, that's in that chapter too. Yeah. And then, so that happens too. At another point in the book, there were, the mass arrests as a result of the bus boycott. And he shared how Black folks were, proud to be arrested, right? The ones who were engaged in these boycotts were actually really excited about being arrested because it meant that their work was successful, right? It meant that their work had meaning. It meant that they were being arrested for the cause of freedom. And that was in the midst of some horrific things that were happening to these folks that they were experiencing at the hands of law enforcement. And so, I don't know. I sort of sat with that and setting aside the horror of it all and what Black folks were experiencing at the time, there was something really so inspiring in those stories, right? Like something so transcendent, and so it also made me stop and think about the parallels between that organizing and movement work to some of the organizing we see now in our present day, right? And you alluded to this a little bit, but like what we saw back in the summer of 2020 after George Floyd was murdered, right? Or what we're seeing now with the Stop Cop City movement, or how young people are mobilizing now against the just senseless gun violence that's happening. So I think there's just so much to learn from and to try to comprehend from the sacrifices that organizers and real people make, and what those folks in the Montgomery boycott, those sacrifices that they experienced, that can certainly be useful and inspiring. Feels like not even worthy, but inspiring to us today, if that makes sense.
Yeah. We spent a good chunk of an episode at some point talking about how much we still have to learn from the Montgomery bus boycott.
That's true.
There's so much of the operating background for how the boycott worked, and how it was organized. And, you think about all the ways that there were carpools, essentially, where there were basically independent buses running that were cars instead of buses. All of that takes so much work and effort in like organizing and making sure people show up on time. And, I think about the ways that I might do that right now. And it's how I don't understand how you did that in 1950, whatever year that was.
Without the phone, without the social media at all. Like, my goodness. Yeah. Absolutely.
And if somebody doesn't show up because something happened, like they get a flat tire or something, like, what? There must have been a process in place. Yeah. But now I'm like, I send a text. Like what? But there's so much to learn from that structure because the structure had to be different, I think. There's a lot to learn from all of that. Definitely. And I think if you take it all the way back to episode 2 of this here show, we were talking about Kingian nonviolence and how it's so applicable to today.
Wow.
There's a long thread of why that movement is so powerful, why it's so meaningful, and why there's still so much to do with it today, how applicable it is today.
I love that.
Yeah. So another piece of the book I want to talk about is this quotation from the All Labor Has Dignity chapter.
Okay.
Which that in itself, that all labor has dignity, he said it at one point in the chapter, and I highlighted that. And I was like, well, I want to bring that in. So I was like, well, I can bring it just by saying the name of the chapter.
That's right.
So this is one of the pieces that I thought you could just say word for word out loud today, and it would still be applicable.
Okay.
Dr. King says, now the problem is not only unemployment. Do you know that most of the poor people in our country are working every day? And they're making wages so low that they cannot begin to function in the mainstream of the economic life of our nation.
Yeah.
These are facts which must be seen, and it is criminal to have people working on a full-time basis and a full-time job getting part-time income.
Wow.
And this was in the context of the sanitation workers strike in Memphis that Dr. King was supporting right before he was killed. And he was setting the context for all of our labor to have dignity.
Yes.
All of it. He said at another point in this same speech that the sanitation workers are just as important as the doctors, because if the sanitation workers stop doing their job, then diseases run rampant.
Absolutely.
And it's so true. And there has to be a consistent recognition from, people in power that we're all important. We all deserve dignity in our work through compensation, through respect.
Yep.
In that. And so that's I just thought that was so powerful. And it also reminded me, I saw recently that Walmart, one of the biggest employers in the United States, encourages its employees to apply for food assistance programs.
Wow.
Because they don't pay them enough.
Yep.
And so, that's something to think about.
Yeah.
Those folks are working and they have to apply for food assistance because Walmart, this giant multi-billion-dollar retail corporation, doesn't pay them enough money.
It's fascinating to me to sit here with you and think about, the Walmart boardroom, right? And that someone had to, in a meeting somewhere, say, well, let's figure out how to address this. Let's figure out what we say to our employees because we're not paying them enough and they're complaining probably, right? Rightfully so, right? So what do we offer? What are the resources we offer? And that is what they decided to do and to offer and to not think about the dignity, the respect that these folks deserve that are helping them continue to be a top employer to make millions of billions of dollars.
Yeah, annually. Billions annually in income.
That's wild.
Yeah.
I think you're absolutely right. That is a quote that could be said today, tomorrow, unfortunately, right?
Yeah.
And I love that piece. I love that piece about, in this context, sanitation workers being just as important as the doctors, right? Like, I don't want to go into an operating room that's dirty, right? And it sure as hell isn't the doctor that's cleaning that room. No. And so, brilliant. I mean, just brilliant. I'm glad you brought that. I think for me in reading this book, time and time again, over and over, there are just countless examples of how Dr. King was radical, right? Hence the name of the book. But more to the point, how he employed this radical idea of radical love, I should say, in his work and in his actions.
Yeah.
And it was great to read his reflections about how he became educated in the practice of nonviolence. So I can't remember what chapter that was, but he spent a lot of time walking us through, his college days and his time in seminary and who he was reading and who was inspiring and influential to him, right? In his thinking and his development in a lot of ways, right? So it's like folks like Thoreau talking about civil disobedience and Rauschenbausch, I don't know if I'm saying that right. How do you say that? Talking about the role of Christianity in social crises. And of course, Marx and Lenin and the writing that was opposed to what they were talking about, right? But it was also great to read about how he first got introduced to Mahatma Gandhi and his teachings and beliefs, and started to realize how Gandhi's philosophy could be used for social reform and social justice. Yeah. I think in many ways, Gandhi's beliefs helped to hone Dr. King's radical beliefs around love and nonviolent resistance. And he even in that chapter, yeah, he spends a lot of time sort of spelling out some of the basic tenets of that philosophy of nonviolence, which was just, for me, awesome to read. I don't have those notes in front of me, but it is absolutely that. I mean, this whole book is worth a read, but that those tenets were beautiful. And I think in thinking about all of the ways in which he was inspired by all of this, all of these great people, like we see how that worked out for him, right? We see how incredibly powerful that was in how he became the man and the radical king that he was, and it makes sense why he was so committed to all of this.
Yeah, I think that was. I had always heard that he was really inspired by Gandhi.
Yeah,
but to read sort of him reflecting on that, I think was really powerful to hear him talking about sort of Gandhi's life and what he learned through that story and some of the parallels he saw and the sort of radical love that Gandhi had.
Yeah.
It was really great to see that and see how it actually like formed and
Yes.
what his reflections were.
Right.
Beyond just the sort of surface level of like, yeah, Dr. King was inspired. by
Right.
Gandhi.
Yeah.
It was great to see the sort of background of all of that.
Absolutely. And then how he applied it, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Speaking of applying, let's talk about application here.
I didn't even plan that. That's good.
How does Dr. King's philosophies here fit into our day-to-day lives?
Yeah.
My application for this week is yet another quotation or two. I think just one is actually what I ended up pulling.
Okay.
That's about power. So Dr. King said, quote, "We can all get more together than we can apart. We can get more organized together than we can apart. And this is the way we gain power. Power is the ability to achieve purpose. Power is the ability to affect change, and we need power." So that's what Dr. King said, and I think that that's still applicable today as well. We have to recognize our collective power together through coalitions, through gathering together to meet the demands of the people, to create the world we need, because it's desperately failing many of us daily in so many ways, and we don't always see it. At one point, Dr. King says something about he's quoting somebody else, and I didn't copy this down, but talking about power is a union, like the United Auto Workers, being able to get the president, the board of GM to say yes when they want to say no in terms of like worker demands.
Yep.
And that's what power is. And I think that that's so astute. Like how do you make, the people in power who are hoarding all of that flip?
Yeah.
And get them to say yes when they want to say no. And they've been saying no for decades.
Forever.
So I think that that's the power that we need to figure out how to harness and build those sort of those larger coalitions. Because there's another point where Dr. King was talking about, he went to a jail, I think. He went to a jail and he was talking to like the white wardens and I think some white prisoners as well. And it was like, well, talk to me about what you believe, what's your experience? Like, what are you making? And so they shared with him, and he was like, you are just as poor as all the people that I'm working with and that I'm organizing with. You should be out there marching with us. Yeah. And I think he talks about that in the drum major speech.
Yes.
And that's so astute too, like just pointing out like there are so many ways that we're kept separate.
Yes.
Right. And so how do you break through that to recognize that we have more demands shared than we don't?
Absolutely. A connected struggle.
Yeah.
Right. I love that quote. I mean, we can all get more together than we can apart. Very astute. And I think as I was trying to think about application here, like it connects to what I was thinking about. Just this, and I know I know I say this often, but this idea of humanity is so big to me, and I think all of his insights and wisdom are so incredibly useful in thinking about our collective humanity. And so I was really just so drawn to and compelled by the notion of humanity throughout this book and the ways in which, you know, he believed that we are all connected beings who deserve to live a full life. All right. And so, and your story there at the end, like, really illustrates that. So I'm glad you brought that up. And I think, you know, he believed that we should have a society and a world that supports that. And so that's sort of a piece of my application. There was one single sentence from Dr. Cornel West's introduction in this book that I think is connected to this, and I loved so much, and I sat with for a while. He said this, quote, "For King, the condition of truth was to allow suffering to speak. For him, justice was what love looks like in public." And I think that belief, justice is what love looks like in public, is exactly what we need, right? We need to ground everything we do as we fight this fight and do this work and ultimately reach that North Star we've talked about in previous episodes. Like, that has got to ground everything we do, right? And this idea of humanity, I think, is all connected to that. So it was really hard to think about application because, I mean, all of it is application. All of it can be applied. All of it everything that he talked about are issues we're still facing today. But yeah, that humanity piece is huge.
Yeah, you mean we haven't solved racism and economic exploitation and war?
Not here in this year of ours, 2023.
Yeah.
Look out, 2024.
I'm coming for you.
Yeah.
All right, let's talk about homework.
Yeah.
What are we going to do to continue to learn from the Radical King after our conversation here today is wrapped up? So there's a few things that come to mind for homework for me this week.
Okay.
One is to learn more about some of the people he thanks along the way through these speeches or essays.
Yes.
Because there's just people that he's acknowledging because he's speaking in front of a group.
Yes.
And so he's just sort of thanking people.
As you would, yeah.
As you might, as you know, to acknowledge what they've contributed. And so two of those people are Septima Clark and Dorothy Cotton, who led the Citizens Education Program through the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which, you know, taught folks more about how the government works and getting involved in politics and registering to vote and things like that.
Absolutely.
And in a chapter called Where Do We Go From Here, Dr. King talks about Operation Breadbasket, which did a whole lot of great work in Chicago,
Yes.
connected to the SCLC, to create new jobs for Black folks there and challenge the structure of the city in a lot of ways. So I'd like to learn more about that too.
I'm going to co-sign that. I'd love to learn more about all of that as well. I think my homework is connected to this idea of continued learning as well, right?
Yeah.
And so a few of the chapters in this book reference Dr. King's memoir about the Montgomery bus boycott, called Stride Toward Freedom, the Montgomery Story. And that was, and reading this book was actually the first I had heard of that book, right?
Yeah.
And so I would love to pick that book up and read it and to learn more because, and I talked about it like that, those stories really got me. And, you know, we know them, but I'm sure there's a whole lot more to learn. I also appreciated learning more about Dr. King's thoughts and reflections about Ben Bella, who was the Algerian premier and president back in the 60s, and Nehru, who was a leader in the Indian nationalist movement back in the 30s and 40s. And I didn't really know too much about either of them before reading these chapters, so I'd love to just do a little bit more research into sort of who they were, what they believed in, what they did, what they accomplished, you know, to sort of understand their lives and legacies and to see how we can apply that too. The amount of folks that he referenced and the great work that they did and the ways in which they were inspiring to him, I think there's so much we can learn from them.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that was where there's a lot of intersection in our homework there. Like, there are all these other folks he's referencing. So how do we how do we learn about them too? Because, you know, as whitewashed as his legacy has been, there still is, like, we know who he is.
Yes.
At least a little bit. And some of these other folks like have are not highlighted in nearly the same way.
Not at all.
So yeah. All right. Well, good stuff. Damien, you're up next time. What are you bringing to the table in our next episode?
I am. All right. So for our next episode, I'm actually going to bring a couple of pieces to the table for us about homelessness.
Okay.
And I don't know. I think I was really influenced and inspired by this book and Dr. King's work to call out conditions in which people find themselves living in, and the sort of pressing call for society to address that. And I happened to be on Truth Out's website last night and just kind of stumbled upon this one piece, and I thought, this feels right. Let me bring this. So the one piece is called "Homeless Sweeps Increase Mortality Rates of Unhoused People, Research Finds." And so again, that's on Truth Out's website. It was written by Zane McNeil, and it's all about this violent act of sweeping of unhoused people by the police in states across the country, right? And the impact of that sort of in both the short and long term. And then the other thing I'm going to bring to the table is a feature or maybe a resource from the National Alliance to End Homelessness called Homelessness and Racial Disparities, which I think is going to give us some good insight and context and education around the current issues and trends related to homelessness in this country, kind of in general. But certainly in that first piece in Truth Out, I think there are a lot of links. So I'm sure we're going to find other things and other pieces and other resources, to bring to our conversation. But I think there's a lot to learn about this topic and the ways in which, homelessness affects all of us, affects all kinds of people. And so I think I'm excited to just have this conversation and see where it goes.
Yeah. Great. Well, I'm looking forward to that. Those sweeps are definitely happening just down the street in DC too.
Yeah. So. Right. Everywhere you look. So yeah.
Yeah. All right. Well, looking forward to that next week. But with that, we want to thank you for listening today and for joining us for Interdependent Study. You know what I'm going to ask you to do here, but in case you forgot, please follow, leave a rating and review, share a podcast with the people in your life, follow us on social media, check us out on YouTube, sign up for our email list to get notified about any new things we got going on behind the scenes.
Yes, thank you so much for listening. And remember, it's not about us, but it is about us. And we'll talk to you next week.